This lecture, How to Handle the Natives, is for an upper level undergraduate course on westward expansion in the United States from 1803 to 1900. It will examine westward expansion into territory occupied by the native nations, the conflicting perspectives of Americans and the Indians, and the methods used by the federal government to fix the Indian problem, with concentrated focus on schools. As the United States expanded westward during the 19th century, one of the greatest challenges facing the federal government was determining how to deal with the Native Americans who already lived throughout the West. To those in authority, the American politicians, military leaders, and to the settlers who were trying to move west. Westward expansion represented progress. It was an economic opportunity and the fulfillment of this great idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to stretch from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific Ocean. However, this expansion brought millions of settlers into lands that the native nations had occupied for generations, and it created increasing competition over land, over resources, over political authority. And there were conflicts over ideologies in how to possess the land, who the land actually belonged to. The government officials of this time often referred to this as the Indian problem. This phrase reflected the perspective of many of the 19th century Americans who believed that Native Americans stood in the way of national growth and settlement. The federal government responded with a series of policies that were intended to solve the problem, including treaty negotiations, forced removal, the reservation system, military campaigns, assimilation programs, and boarding schools. While many of the government leaders argued these policies would promote peace and encourage civilization and unite the nation, they also resulted in the loss of native lands and cultures, political independence, and in many cases, thousands of lives. From the perspective of the Native Americans, there was no Indian problem. Instead, the native nations viewed themselves as sovereign people defending their ancestral homes, their cultures, their way of life against an expanding United States. Many tribes attempted to negotiate through treaties and diplomacy, while others challenged federal policies in court or resisted through armed conflict. Throughout the 19th century, Native peoples demonstrated remarkable resilience by preserving their languages, their traditions, their religions, and communities despite tremendous pressure to assimilate into American society. There was an overwhelming idea that Native Americans were uneducated savages, and the best way to fix them was through schools. So the bulk of this presentation is going to focus on educating the Indian out of the natives. It's important to recognize that Native Americans were already educating their children long before the federal government stepped in. So every tribe had its own methods of teaching history, religion, language, survival. The students learned from family members and elders in the tribe. They learned how to participate in community life. They were learning about how to be future leaders in their tribe and their religion and the community responsibilities that were in store for them. In 1819, the Civilization Fund Act was passed. And this fund paid churches and missionary organizations to educate Native Americans in the ways of the white man and had a goal to replace Native American customs and traditions and religions with Euro American culture. To really understand the federal government's approach, this quote from the Board of Commissioners is quite helpful. It says, as a savage, we cannot tolerate him. The only alternative left is to fit him by education for civilized life. So, what are they defining as civilized? And what assumptions are being made about Native Americans here? How would education be viewed as a solution? Civilized means just like us? It's a really important thing to ponder and consider when you look at this history. By the early 19th century, two educational systems with opposing goals existed. You had tribal schools and federal schools. The tribal schools, if you look, these two are total opposites. Tribal schools are run by native nations, federal schools by missionaries and government. One preserves the culture, one replaces it. One is teaching their native language, the other is English only. One teaches their actual history, the other American history. One is going to preserve their culture while the other destroys it through assimilation. One of the ways in dealing with the native problem was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which required all Native Americans to be west of the Mississippi River. And of course, the great tragedy that many are familiar with was the Trail of Tears, which was a forced march of Native Americans where around 4,000 Cherokee Indians died on the trail. But following the Indian Removal Act, the government expanded educational efforts through manual labor schools. Academic instruction changed and became secondary to vocational training. And these schools often relied on the native student labor, and many churches profited from these systems. Toward the end of the 19th century, government officials decided that the day schools they had for Native Americans really were not working. And so they came up with a solution: boarding schools. And the most famous of these schools was the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, which was founded by Captain Richard Henry Pratt in 1879. Now, Pratt believed that native culture, not native people, was the problem. So his goal was to eliminate native identity and replace it with American culture. The great philosophy behind Pratt's school was complete assimilation. Now, I put here on the screen an excerpt from some of Pratt's writing. He says, "A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, and that high sanction of his destruction has been an enormous factor in promoting Indian massacres. In a sense, I agree with that sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him, save the man." Now, he went on to say quite a bit more, but I think that this statement really clarifies his views on Native Americans. It's an idea of killing out that culture completely, which was assimilation into white culture. As federal education for Native Americans transitioned to boarding schools, they began to exclude native languages and customs. They required manual labor and often removed children from their homes through compulsory attendance. Look at some of the things that are listed here: lost traditional clothing, haircuts, English names, wearing uniforms, forbidden to speak native languages, not just taught English, forbidden to speak their own tongue, practicing Christianity, native manual labor, separated from family. Now, here I've got in the corner a picture of a couple of Lipan Apache children that were at the Carlisle School. And here are some examples, just shots of students that were at the Carlisle School who were going about their day in the different classes: ironing, printing, sitting in class, in the gymnasium. Here are some examples of Apache students from the Carlisle School. Notice the drastic difference in student appearance. On the left is the before and on the right is the after. This is another student from the school, Tom Tolino, who was a Navajo Indian. You notice there's quite a distinct difference from his entry in 1882 to his departure 3 years later. It is important not to overlook the psychological impact on students that these schools had. This quote here from Sun Elk, a Pueblo student at the Carlisle School, really emphasizes that. He said in his quote, "They told us that Indian ways were bad. They said we must get civilized. It means be like the white man. And the books told us how bad the Indians had been to the white men, burning their towns and killing their women and children. But I had seen white men do that to Indians. We all wore white men's clothes and ate white men's food and went to white men's churches and spoke white men's talk. And so after a while, we also began to say Indians were bad." We laughed at our own people. Now consider that the students are encouraged not only to change their appearance, but also reject their own identity. This illustrates why historians often describe boarding schools as instruments of cultural assimilation. Native Americans as a whole were not against education. It's not that they were against schools. What they were opposed to was education that destroyed their culture, that required them abandoning their own identity. Sitting Bull is also a great illustration of the opinion of the Native Americans. He said, if the Great Spirit had desired me to be a white man, he would have made me so in the first place. He put in your heart certain wishes and plans. In my heart, he put other and different desires. Each man is good in the sight of the Great Spirit. It is not necessary that eagles should be crows. He's arguing that different cultures could coexist without one replacing the other, and his statement challenged the assumption that becoming civilized meant becoming white. I think it's important to really understand the impact of these schools. If you look at the statistics, by 1900, there were over 300 federally funded Indian schools in total, but around half of those were boarding schools. And the total annual enrollment was around 25,000 to 30,000. But in 1900, about 20,000 of those enrolled were enrolled in boarding schools. The numbers for educating Native American students in schools continued to climb until 1969. At that point, there were over 400 boarding schools that were federally funded, and combined with the other schools, there were 523. And at the 150 plus years of these schools, there were over hundreds of thousands of students who had attended. Now, one of the great questions that comes from this is the compulsory nature of Indian education. Were Native children forcibly removed from the home? Yes and no. There wasn't a single nationwide policy in the 1800s that required every Native child to be seized by force, but federal officials used several methods to compel attendance. Some of the ways parents were compelled in this, they were threatened with the loss of government food rations or annuities. Reservation agents withheld supplies from families who refused to send children. Federal agents and soldiers sometimes physically removed children from their homes. Children were often transported hundreds or even thousands of miles away to off-reservation boarding schools. After 1891, Congress authorized Commissioner of Indian Affairs to enforce compulsory attendance, giving the government greater authority to remove children whose parents refused to comply. By the 1890s, attendance at many boarding schools was really no longer truly voluntary. Thomas Jefferson Morgan was the Commissioner of Indian Affairs. He was a great supporter of compulsory education, boarding schools, Indian only instruction, government authority over Native families. He believed that education was more important than parental authority. Now, I've put a partial quote on your screen, but I'm going to read this whole paragraph, and this will really show his true thoughts on the matter. I do not believe that Indians, people who for the most part speak no English, live in squalor and degradation, make little progress from year to year, who are a perpetual source of expense to the government and a constant menace to thousands of their white neighbors, a hindrance to civilization, and a dog on our progress, have any right to forcibly keep their children out of school to grow up like themselves, a race of barbarians and semi-savages. Now think about that. This was the man in charge of Indian affairs. As I close out this presentation, I want to remind you education is just one of the ways that was used to handle the natives. But I also want you to leave reflecting on this question. To what extent did Indian boarding schools achieve the federal government's goals? And at what cost to Native American communities? Everything we do, for every bit of progress, there is a price that has to be paid. Was it really worth the cost that was paid? Have a great week.